Hello, indeed.
I'm beyond words almost that you agreed to this so easily and quickly, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, it's my pleasure. Tell me a bit about what you do.
Yeah, so I studied all sorts of things, and especially economics and cognitive science and applied psychology. And all of that was great and good and useful. And then I kind of just started studying philosophy, and I have many friends that are in philosophy departments, and my friend John Vervaeke in particular has put out this 50 episode series that goes from Marcus Aurelius, Socrates, Jesus, and the Buddha kind of to cognitive science and the modern world. And he just really made me value those things in a whole different way. I mean, as a kid, I loved reading books in the philosophy department, a section of the library. And so now I read with a Plato group every Sunday for about the last 7 months or so. We've been reading the dialogues, maybe half a dialogue per week. And we do
Wonderful.
philosophical practices. My friend John, kind of inspired by a lot of research and other people, created this dialectic practice and this fellowship kind of group practice around sacred texts. Um, and I just find it so rewarding, the capacity for transformation, and appreciating things like beauty and character. I think one of the things that I've really grown to appreciate a lot and that I loved about your book was just this kind of invisible world of character that no one talks about. Um, and I also love art and reading, and I teach. I've been teaching for, I don't know, almost 17 years. I've taught undergraduates, I've taught law students, MBA students. Um, I've been participated in one of the, at the time, I think the largest concurrent live digital class on earth. So I love education. Um, and your book, just, it was awesome. It's such an amazing work. My friend John, that I just mentioned, recommends it a lot. And I don't know, and bless you, by the way.
Sorry.
No, no.
Well, thank you.
Does that give you a little bit of a picture?
Yeah, sure does. I'm so glad to hear you're reading Plato so much.
We just finished the Phaedrus, and we did not read your translation, but I have a Greek tutor that I translate works with, and I'm gonna definitely look at your book with her. And yeah, you've done, like, can I just read your bio for a second, then maybe you can add to that, like what drew you to philosophy, and
Sure.
just so people will see this. Um, so just from Amazon, I love the way they wrote this. It says Paul Woodruff is a philosopher, writer, and translator at the University of Texas at Austin. For 24 years, he was engaged in administration as a department chair, program director, and dean. As dean of undergraduate studies, he introduced a new core curriculum across all majors and brought various student support programs into harmony around their shared mission, which is amazing. I've read more about some of the things that you did there, and it's just, I don't know, you're the coolest person. So his father, Arch Woodruff Jr., was almost expelled from Williams in 1932 for moving a non-bearing wall in the theater there to make room for sets he was building. As an administrator, you have devoted to moving whatever walls obstruct learning and teaching. So I love that. And you have so many amazing books, such as the Bacchae, this Reverence book that we're going to talk about today, on justice, power, and human nature, selections from history of the Peloponnesian War, the necessity of theater, the art of watching and being watched, the Ajax dilemma, justice, fairness, and rewards, as well as just so many amazing classics of Greek translations, the Ion, the Phaedrus, so many. You studied under Gregory Velastos, who is a lover of Socrates and an amazing thinker in his own right. And yeah, you just have walked the talk and walked into places where most people don't walk. So what an amazing list of things to read off. And what am I missing? Like, why do you love philosophy? who in their right mind would dedicate so much of their time to this thing called philosophy?
Well, the first philosopher you mentioned, Marcus Aurelius, was the first one I read at about age 13. And I fell in love with philosophy and with the message he was sending out. And I've been uh, fascinated with philosophy ever since. I'm slightly out of step, I think, with most academic philosophers because I think at a fairly early stage, I, I, I became interested in philosophy not just as an intellectual pursuit, but as a way of living, which is the ancient approach to philosophy. And though at Princeton and then at Oxford, where I was a student, philosophy seemed very much a kind of intellectual game, and I felt somewhat alienated from it. But then, after my experience in the Army, in the American War in Vietnam, I really felt strongly that philosophy had to be about had to connect with the way we live, and the classical idea that studying philosophy should help you live a better life seemed to me fundamental. But as I said, it does put me to some extent out of step with most academic philosophy. And but I've been fortunate. I was able to do enough conventional scholarship, which I love doing, that I was able to get tenure at a major university, and I've been able to use that position to do a lot of things that I love that wouldn't count towards tenure, like making these translations or writing the book about Reverence, which is not an academic book.
Yeah, I love Pierre Hadot and his quest for trying to live the good life, and he rejected Catholicism at the time in some ways in forms that it was presented to the world, and then kind of has this great Greek revival of what is virtue and what is attention and how should we live the good life rather than arguing. I think that Socrates' kind of greatest thing is he keeps pulling the argument back to ethics and justice over
Yeah,
and over again. And you could pontificate, you can write papers, and there's people that do that really well. But that's why I never studied philosophy in college beyond undergraduate courses. And I had some amazing teachers in undergraduate. I had a teacher that would take us outside and talk about the golden mean and would talk about comparative religion, and in such a way that it was lived and not just to memorize facts, which were important. In fact, I think one of the things that I loved about your book is you say, remembering your humanity is not like remembering facts. What does that mean? Like, why should someone carry that thought in their head?
yes, well, I think, as I say in the book, we need a felt recognition of our humanity, of our human limitations. I think I'm glad you mentioned Socrates. My my latest book, which is supposed to be out in September, is called "Living Toward Virtue: Practical Ethics in the Spirit of Socrates." Uh, Socrates, a large part of Socrates' effort is to make people really feel their humanity by recognizing what it is that they don't know, and how important it is to realize the limits of your understanding. What Socrates calls human wisdom in Plato's Apology is really his ability to uh, recognize the limits of his wisdom. I think it's one of the most important things to do. So much of where we go wrong is due to our irreverent presumption that we know what we're doing when we really don't.
Yeah, I loved when you talked about compassion and the way you talked about it, and definitely correct me, is that it's because we're weak, because we're fragile, that we should remember that and act compassionately to the world. And sometimes compassion feels like a duty, or it feels like um, something you're doing for like moral credit or something like that. But when you reflect and go, I don't have all the answers, and my students have some of the answers, and the leaders in my life have some of the answers, and my mother has some of the answers. When you open up that way in compassion, it's a really beautiful way to think about it. So why did you choose to put that in the book, or what is compassion?
Yes, in thinking about reverence after I published the first edition of the book, I began to realize more and more the importance of compassion and the relationship between reverence and compassion. The ancient Greeks believed that the gods were immune to compassion because they could not suffer and they could not imagine themselves suffering anything serious, any serious suffering. Whereas human beings should be able to imagine quite easily uh, being the victims of the suffering they observe in others, and therefore feel compassion. So it's a large subject, but I think a really important one. It's, as I understand compassion, it's not sharing other people's feelings, it's recognizing them and taking other people's feelings into account in a reverent way. I think the virtues are all connected, compassion and reverence and so on.
Yeah, I like the way you talk about virtue, um, and you say things like philosophers don't always consider reverence or even respect or compassion virtues. And one of the things that my friend John points out in his series is how the Greek virtues, really Christianity adds so much to the Greek virtues in the suffering and the love of Christ, and agape. Like the Greeks use the word agape, but there's something about like the suffering of Christ or even the suffering of Buddha. He sees all of the suffering in the world, and has this kind of metanoia, to become like a priestly figure rather than a kingly figure. And yeah, why should philosophers, if like a philosopher that might teach 5,000 students or more in their lifetime, why should they consider reverence a virtue?
Um, well, you use the word teach. Uh, I think a reverent uh, approach to uh, dealing with young people uh, really does not allow you to think of yourself as a teacher. Uh, we've been talking a bit about Socrates. It's important to me about Socrates that he never represents himself as a teacher, that he's always trying to stimulate people, sometimes with what he compares to the bite of a gadfly. He's trying to stimulate people to use their own resources to come to the best understanding they can of important questions about virtue and the good life. He doesn't think he knows what a teacher would have to know in order to teach other people how to live. He does think he knows how to ask the questions that will lead somebody or lead people to use their own resources to become wiser in a human way. But there's no teaching that can make you wiser. That is, there's nothing that I or Socrates or any other teacher can do to implant wisdom in a student. The student has to take on the task of becoming wiser, and no so-called teacher can do that for another person.
Yeah, I really like you have a chapter on reverence without a creed, and that what you said reminds me of that, how you can't just hand people credos and have them mindlessly internalize them. And how is it is very abstract in some ways, thinking of reverence and the sacred not as being objects, or not mindlessly saying, oh, because it's part of a religious tradition or a prestigious philosophical tradition, that it must be good. How is reverence not like in the objects or necessarily even in acts? Like what is your, yeah, maybe I'm saying this poorly, but you know what I'm kind of trying to get at?
I'm not sure I've got the question right, but let me try and answer, and you can tell me if I'm
Okay.
I'm on the right track. What I've learned by thinking about reverence, I think applies to all of human virtue. But I'd never thought of this before I started pondering the nature of reverence. Reverence is such that if you think you've got it, you've lost it. And that's really important. I didn't realize that when I wrote the first edition of the book. It was working on the second edition and trying to answer people's questions. Whenever I spoke about reverence, people would say, well, what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to renew reverence? How can we recapture it? And that word capture, I began to realize, is misleading. Reverence has to be a project to which you're committed. You're never going to capture it and keep it firmly lodged in you. It's because of that important point I realized after I'd written the first edition. If you think you've got it, you've lost it. It's an irreverent thought that you are reverent, right? And the gods might be able to achieve ideal virtues, though I doubt if reverence of humanity. And it's so easy to forget our limitations. It's so easy to think confidently that we know what we're doing. It's so easy to think we're better than other people. And we're probably hardwired in some way to think that we're better than other people. Each of us thinks, I'm better than the average. There are plenty of studies that show that, but that's an irreverent thought and a dangerous one because it can lead you to make mistakes that you don't recognize. So I've begun to think of reverence not just as a virtue, but as a kind of virtue behind all the other virtues. That, a philosopher might want to call it a meta virtue. It's fundamental to the quest for virtue. Unlike the other virtues, reverence is fundamental to the quest for virtue. It's not just a virtue in its own right. It lies behind the whole enterprise of what I'm now calling living toward virtue.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was inarticulately trying to say. That's excellent, because as soon as you think you possess something, then you can be hubristic. And
Right.
as soon as you think you know someone completely, that's when you start taking them for granted. But if you have a sense of wonder and respect for someone you love, and you can recognize that whatever you see, there's always so much more to them and to the world, that it's bottomless. It's this kind of yeah, what you said was excellent. And what is hubris? Maybe we could talk about that for a moment. Like, how do modern people, how can we think better about hubris? Because I loved that concept in college, and I have friends that are, one of my close friends is aspiring to be a preacher, and we always talk about how easy it is to be proud of like how high up we are or how awesome we are, and that's almost like the perennial first problem as you become confident and successful in anything. So yeah, how can modern people better think about hubris?
Well, let me back up a little bit to my own interests. Around the time I became interested in philosophy, I also became interested in Greek tragic theater. I read Sophocles' Oedipus, and I was fascinated by it. And Oedipus, is a model of hubris. He's in many ways an admirable man. He sets out to solve the problem of the plague in his city, and he cares about other people. He's absolutely confident that he can solve this problem because he's solved other problems before. And that illustrates one of the important things to remember about hubris, that hubris is usually a consequence of success. And the ancient Greeks realized this. If you're very successful at anything, that's when you should stop and take account and think about your limitations, because success tends to instill in us the idea that we have what it takes to succeed at whatever. And this is a dangerous and a limiting thought, which I think the Greeks understood. How when you win a victory, that's, of course, when you're inclined to rejoice, but it's also when you should start worrying about what that victory will do to you. And this is a common theme in in Greek tragedy. Hubris, we often translate it overweening pride. It's a word that has many uses in Greek that are different from that. Just various kinds of crime can simply be called hubris. Outrageous behavior generally can be called hubris. But what's important in this tragic tradition is the kind of hubris that is illustrated by the case of Oedipus, an admirable man. He's done good things for the city, and so he believes that basically he believes he can do no wrong, and he's going to find otherwise. What I learned from studying and translating Greek tragedy is that the word hubris doesn't occur so very much. It does occur, especially in the Oedipus, but there are various other ways of referring to that phenomenon. But the concept that keeps coming up is the antidote to hubris, and the antidote to hubris, of course, turns out to be reverence. A felt recognition of the human, a capacity for awe at the transcendent, often expressed beautifully by the chorus in a Greek tragedy. I don't know if that answers your question about hubris, but it's
No,
a really important concept.
I had some great teachers in undergraduate, and they exposed us to Oedipus and many of the Greek tragedies. And are there any modern like cultural movies or things like shows today that do that well? Like if someone was young and they couldn't quite connect to Oedipus, which is a beautiful, amazing story, are there other like good examples that you could think of today?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure I'm the person to answer it, since I'm not a, a good consumer of modern culture. I live so much in the Greek past. I certainly see examples of hubris in history, recent history. I thought the triumphalism that sort of raged through this country when the Soviet Union collapsed was an example of hubris, and the sort of overconfidence in the victory of capitalism over communism, I think, has led us to make some mistakes. And of course, there are many other examples of modern hubris. I don't think that our popular culture does justice to the problem of hubris and the danger of success. But as I said, I'm not the best person to ask about this.
No, that was excellent. Why, how just to play a little bit, like how could the people in media or leadership or in our family lives or wherever we are have acted more reverentially in that moment, in the moment of the fall of the Berlin Wall, let's say, or the 6 or 8 years after that, when Russia really just splintered apart in greater ways? Like what would have been a really beautiful way to respond to that as a group?
Um, I've been puzzling about this recently because I think one of the causes of the current crisis in Europe was our sort of our triumphalist uh, advance against the former Soviet Union, and what I see is a, a project to sort of rub the noses of the Russian people in their defeat. I think, and I think we're paying a high price for that now. What would it have taken uh, back in the late 80s, early 90s uh, to welcome Russia into the community of peace-loving nations? You know, the what our success with Germany and Japan is remarkable. You know, we defeated those dangerous nations in 1945, and then what we did, I think, was quite remarkable when you look back on it. It's rare in history. Uh, we made a great effort to put both nations back on their feet and succeeded remarkably well, it seems to me. There was I remember a story in the mid 1950s in the Saturday Evening Post called The Mouse That Roared. It was about a small country, a fictional country, somewhere in Central Europe that was experiencing serious financial difficulties. And their leadership decided the way out was to declare war on the US and be defeated so the US would pump money into it. And I think everybody thought that was a good joke. But I think our history would be very different if we had taken a much more positive and compassionate approach to Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Russia is still very poor in terms of individual incomes. Its health outcomes are weak. It's as autocratic as ever, almost as autocratic as ever. I think there could be a very different story had we taken a different approach. But that's to use what philosophers call a counterfactual. And we have no way of knowing whether a counterfactual is true.
No, I think you're right. When people there's this martial art called Aikido, and it's about making space. Like, it assumes the world has enemies, and then assumes they'll come at you, and then it's about kind of just not dying to their energy and then loving them afterwards. That's a kind of an oversimplification of it. And there's something like I remember when there was a giant tsunami in India, and people were complaining about all of the aid that the US was spending there. And it was something like 1% of 1% of our GDP. It was such a small amount in the massiveness. And those moments, not only do they help suffering people, but like you're saying, they build this kind of extended in time goodwill between two others, we could say, in the world. And you know, I loved, even in high school or college, when we have like sister colleges in Japan or in South America, and we share a call or get letters from these groups and go, oh, this is so cool. There's this world beyond the world I kind of think about every day. And they're thinking about us, and we're communicating a little bit. And when you have those, it's almost the opposite of Cain and Abel, where you show goodwill just in this kind of place of strength and in a hopeful way, and then see what happens. And like you said, in South Korea, who is now a great ally to us, in Japan, in a lot of places where we have allowed them to thrive, they joined the Western world. South Korea is an amazing example. They produce some of the best solar technology, some of the best routers, really great education. They have a healthy rivalry with our phone companies, and their Samsung phones make Apple try harder and make Microsoft try harder. And they could have just hated us. They could have not at all cared about our culture. And then we get to enjoy the nuance and the beauty of their culture. They have there was this, I won't ramble on, but there was an artist called Psy, this musician, and he was the first YouTube video to have 1 billion views. And I remember seeing him live in this place near me, and it's beautiful when cultures talk. You get to just see so much. I mean, even after World War II, one of my friends says one of the great things about that is all of our soldiers went there and learned from the French and learned from the British and learned from these other cultures, and then brought that back. And then all of a sudden it's like almost predictable that in the 50s we had this cultural boom. All these new ideas were coming back from Europe. And so no, I think there's something really, really powerful when you can have good sportsmanship to a rival after they fall. I mean, even the Iliad kind of these great epics do these things. So what about relativism? How pernicious is relativism, or why did you write about it in your book?
Well, relativism can mean many things. I think there is a kind of relativism that I think we need to recognize, and that is that in different cultures and in different situations, the various virtues are expressed in different ways. For example, there are different ways of showing respect in different cultures, and they're sort of relative to those cultures. So I do want to support a certain kind of limited relativism. Some people say, oh, that's not relativism, but it is in a sense. The kind of relativism that I'm arguing against in this book is the sort that seems to presume that we human beings can make things right or wrong just by believing as groups that they're right or wrong. Denying education to women is not right merely because the majority of people in, say, Afghanistan think it's right. That doesn't make it right. And our practices don't make the contrary approach right either. It's hubris to suppose that we can make things right or wrong through our own consensus within a given culture. So the problem that I see with this kind of relativism that thinks that right and wrong are created within a culture is that it blocks progress, it blocks communication, it blocks the important reverent quest for deeper understandings.
Yeah, that's excellent. I had a lot of thoughts about what you said there, and I I love the story of Hypatia and even some of the Stoics and they're kind of countercultural heroes in these different ways when they reach into across the aisle and um, Epictetus is like a Socratic figure to me and his humility and his openness to kind of care about so many different types of people and not get caught up on it's so I guess it's so dangerous when you think your group has all the answers is maybe what you're saying in a big way. So to maybe switch it a little bit, why is how is poetry important? It seems like something that is so unimportant to most people. It's secondary, it's less respected in the academy, I would say, in a lot of ways. Um, but you seem to hold poetry. And one thing you say is writing poetry is one way you can show reverence in an irreverent society. Like, what are some thoughts on poetry in that quote, maybe?
Oh, thank you for asking that question. Um, this question belongs to the context in which I talk about the languages of reverence. Uh, how do you speak if you know that you don't know what you're talking about? You know, um, the I don't know if you read much Chinese philosophy, but the Tao Te Ching uh, is uh, is a series of poems, or it is itself a large poem, and it is the poem that it is because its author or authors, Lao Tzu or whoever, uh, recognize that they don't have words to say uh, what they believe is so important. And it starts right out. The Tao that can be Tao is not Tao. You know, if you say it, you've lost it. Um, and so the value of poetry, like the value of music, poetry is a kind of word music. The value is that it allows us to uh, to use language in ways that go deeper than the literal meaning of the words. And oh, there's so much to say about this.
Yeah,
I
please
read
do.
poetry every day and I write it. Um, Plato's criticism of poetry is a large topic. Um, he is of all the philosophers in the Western tradition, the one whose style and content is most influenced by poets. I mean, his language is full of poetry, and yet he says he's waging war against the poets. That's a very complicated subject, but I think you have to, in all of the uh, most reverent uh, philosophical texts, I think you find poetry or elements of poetry.
Yeah, Plato's gift with language comes from he was, I think, studying to be like a tragic writer and then encountered Socrates and became a philosopher. And I've read the Ion with some really brilliant people and translated little tiny pieces of it and reread it. And there is almost like a soul at war with itself in Plato because he uses language so amazingly. Like the Phaedrus, the imagery and the storytelling are just some of the best in Western literature, I would say, and it just grabs your attention in a way that like a list of facts could not, and it's so powerful. And again, like we just devalue poetry so much in its trivia if you have extra time, but you're writing poetry, it sounds like a lot. So how should someone that wanted to like bring poetry and philosophy together, or like living a good life and this poetic expression, like how would they train if they were to try and do it the best they could, maybe?
Um, it's a hard question. Uh, I can't help it, you know. Um, because I want to express uh, I want to express ideas and feelings for which a literal use of language just doesn't serve. Um, and so I think I'm driven to read poetry and try to write it uh, for that reason. Uh, I do think we philosophers can do a lot of good using language literally and making clear and sharp distinctions. But that's not the only thing we should be doing. But that's the best I can do.
Who are a couple of your favorite poets, or if you had a student that was eager to get into poetry, kind of like the way the Theaetetus, he's so eager to learn philosophy from Socrates. Like, what's maybe something you would recommend?
Well, of course, I'll start with Sophocles. I think is the greatest of the Greek playwrights, and I think the greatest playwright of all time. For poets writing in English, uh, I think Tennyson's In Memoriam is a wonderfully uh, reverent piece of work. It's Tennyson was not a mental giant, but he was very deep, and he had an extraordinary ability to use language musically. Uh, In Memoriam is written, it's a book-length poem. It's written all in the same stanza form that could be boring, and yet every line has a different feeling to it because he was such a master of word music. And he's coping with the death of a dear friend, which seems to him meaningless. And he's refusing to give that event an easy meaning. It is throughout a deeply reverent poem. So I give that as an example. For contemporary or more recent poets, Merwin, I think, is a reverent poet. Uh, Stanley Kunitz, those are two recently departed poets. For living poets, I recommend Naomi Nye. And of course, there are many others. I'm just scratching the surface.
Yeah, it really resonated with me when you said, they didn't take the easy way to describe things. They described Um, that's what I always like about the Iliad and the Odyssey. They describe death as the dragging of flesh and hair across the battlefield, and they don't make it childish. You realize how sad war is when you see these heroic godlike people fall, and when Priam's wife weeps, and these moments aren't just glossed over. Yeah, that's excellent what you said. I also, just kind of maybe keeping on beauty, you said beauty of character is what the ancient philosophers meant by virtue. Like, what is character, and how can we help our friends cultivate the character they want, or cultivate character in ourselves? Like you mentioned the Tao talks about how cultivating virtue in oneself, and then one's family, and then one's and up to nation, and so on. Like, how does one cultivate character? What is it?
Um, it's Plato's Socrates who introduced me to the idea that the soul could be beautiful, and that beauty of soul is more important than beauty of body. And I think that's true, that what we're really drawn to when we love other people is plainly not just beauty of body, because that's all over I mean, there are many beautiful bodies out there, but the beauty of soul can be quite particular and unique to the individual. And I think, uh, though beauty of soul is not readily apparent, uh, I think we see it with what I like to call the eye of love. When we love somebody, we see their inner beauty. And it's hard to see it in people unless we love them. Uh, Character, I suppose, consists of virtues and other traits. And I've recently tried to stop using the word, because if you think of character as consisting of traits that you have, uh, then it's a misleading concept for virtue, because on the Socratic view, you don't actually have virtues, you work on having them. They're commitments and they're projects to which you're committed. So I've retreated from the modern word character, which Socrates does not use. Socrates doesn't use the Greek equivalent, to the Platonic notion of soul. And I think it's a good friend of mine helped me see that we can think of the soul as something dynamic, growing, committed, uh, as very close to your who you are, and your identity, whereas character sounds like something fixed and alien to the person that you are. Uh, so I've traded the word character for the word soul, uh, which is not a word that philosophers are comfortable using. And yet, it seems to me, if we're going to talk seriously about ethics and one's moral commitments, we need the word soul. So that's where I am on that at this point.
Yeah, that's excellent. It reminds me of Epictetus, who and Socrates both, that they make this kind of weird argument that doing bad hurts oneself, and like one's soul is damaged by bad acts, which when the Stoics are so good at saying all you control is kind of your own actions, and that's what you should put your energy and attention towards. And when you realize, like, oh, I'm not caring enough, or I'm stealing or lying, or and you can have these insights and go, no, 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 my soul matters. My soul matters, or other people's souls matters. Do you believe in Plato's tripartite soul, or what is it's such an interesting thing that he alludes to
Yeah,
and talks about.
that's a good question. Um, Socrates and Plato's and Epictetus concern with uh, what we now call moral injury uh, is much more in the news now than it has been until recently, because of the recognition that war veterans and other people who've been through great moral traumas uh, do feel moral injury. And the injury is really to their sense of who they are, which is, I think, best understood in terms of the soul. They feel that their souls are damaged. You know, they wouldn't use the word character for this. I don't think. They feel that they themselves are uh, in their very identity uh, wounded and divided. Uh, uh, Plato's Plato's theory of the soul, I now think is more complicated than that three-part soul we get in the Republic, uh, because Plato in earlier dialogues, especially the Gorgias, holds that any division in the soul is a sign of trauma, of moral injury. That in a truly healthy soul, reason and desire and emotion are all pulling together the way they have to in the Phaedrus, in that wonderful image. That for them to be divided in any kind of conflict is itself a moral injury. And that notion of the divided soul comes up in connection with the Callipolis that Plato is constructing uh, as a kind of thought experiment. And remember, if you read the Republic closely, you'll see that the Callipolis is not the ideal city. It's a city that is constructed so as to allow for luxuries that we don't really need. I translate Callipolis the fancy city,
I
because there's
love
a
this.
simpler city that I think Socrates would prefer. It's a fancy city because it allows for luxuries, and because it allows for luxuries, they need doctors and lawyers. He specifies those two groups as groups that you would not need in a healthy city. And the analog goes for the soul. You don't need lawyers and doctors for the soul in a harmonious soul. All the elements of the soul get along together and form a unity. So that's a long and complex answer, but I think for Plato and for the view that I want to support, the goal is a harmonious soul and not a divided one.
I like a lot of the post-Socratics, but Epicurus and some of the people like him talk about ataraxia, and I think of it very similar to what you're saying of a lack of tumult. My friend John would say is half of it, so that harmony, and you don't have parts of yourself pulling yourself in different directions emotionally or in decisions or relationships, and then like your outward expression is also good and happy and pleasant. And when you have that lack of problems and the good outward expression, you don't need doctors or even priests or lawyers, and things work well together. So yeah, that was excellent. And I love the fancy city. I'm going to start saying that. That is just a fun way to think about that. So maybe one last thing that you said, I don't want to take up all your time, and this has been excellent. You said reverence declares itself through silence more deeply and more truly than through speech. So what does that mean? Or yeah.
I I find that the the greatest uh, the greatest influences come from people who know when to be silent. And by silence, I don't mean the silence of the dead.
Hmm.
I, I mean silence that is framed in a certain way. Um, there's a famous story about a Buddhist sage named Vimalakirti uh, who was summoned by a king in India to a contest of speakers uh, about Buddhist teaching. And the other sages gave long, eloquent speeches, but Vimalakirti stood up and was silent and won the contest. So we're told. Uh, that silence only has the effect of wisdom in that context. I think that Confucius uses silence effectively. Uh, he says at one point, uh, I'll pick up one corner of the rug. My uh, those who follow me have to pick up the other three. Confucius answers people's questions, but he always answers them with a riddle, and the riddle is a kind of silence. What does he mean when he says virtue has neighbors? It could mean a lot of things. Uh, and he's silent about what meaning uh, he has for it. Socrates asks questions. He's not silent uh, in that respect. He asks questions, but he doesn't answer them. And so he's silent in that very important way. Silence is a recognition of reverence of our limitations, and an invitation to others to do their own thinking. So I think that silence, if framed appropriately, is the best expression of reverence.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to end this, I think, because it really kind of comes full circle to what you've been saying a lot today of letting people discover things for themselves, not feeling like you have all the answers. Um, even that there are things that are beyond language and propositions and statements, and yeah, just would you do this again if I read another one of your books? Would you entertain me another time and talk more about this? Because I know there's a lot of people
Yes, if I'm
that are hungry for these things.
if I'm up to it, I would be happy to do that again. Thank you for good questions.
Thank you so much, Paul. I can't recommend your books enough highly. I will publish this and link to some of your videos and other books that are online. And this has been an absolute joy. Like I've learned more about reverence from your book on reverence and respect and what these things are and are not, and how they're continual. And so just thank you so much. And yeah, I really appreciate our
Well,
talk
thank
today.
you for good questions. So
Thanks,
we'll
Paul.
talk again sometime. Good luck.
Okay. Have a great afternoon and thank you so much.
You too.